On June 26, 1945, delegates in San Francisco signed a charter that claimed an almost impossible purpose: to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. The Second World War was not yet formally over in the Pacific. Cities had been bombed into ruins. Soldiers were still deployed across continents and oceans. Millions of displaced people were moving through camps, ports, rail stations, and broken roads. In that setting, the United Nations Charter was not a ceremonial dream. It was a wager that rules, institutions, and power politics could be forced into the same room before another catastrophe began. The idea did not come from nowhere. After the First World War, the League of Nations had promised collective security, arbitration, and a way to restrain aggression. It failed to stop Japan in Manchuria, Italy in Ethiopia, or Nazi Germany in Europe. The United States never joined. Great powers ignored it when the price of action looked too high. By 1945, the League was not just an institution that had failed. It was a warning about what a peace system could not survive: weak enforcement, missing major powers, and a gap between moral language and military reality. Franklin Roosevelt believed a new organization had to avoid that mistake. He wanted the major wartime allies inside the structure from the beginning. He also understood that an organization with no connection to force would be fragile. Winston Churchill, Joseph Stalin, and Roosevelt did not share the same vision of the post-war world, but they shared one lesson from the 1930s. If the great powers stayed outside a peace system, that system would have little chance when crises arrived. The future United Nations was therefore born from both idealism and suspicion. The phrase United Nations had first described the Allied coalition fighting the Axis powers. In January 1942, governments that signed the declaration by United Nations pledged to continue the war together and not make a separate peace. That wartime coalition was not yet a universal institution. It was an alliance against enemies. But it created a name, a habit of coordination, and an argument. If nations could cooperate to defeat aggression, perhaps they could also create a forum to prevent it. Planning intensified at Dumbarton Oaks in Washington in 1944. There, representatives of the United States, Britain, the Soviet Union, and China sketched the organization's basic machinery. A General Assembly would give member states a deliberative forum. A Security Council would carry primary responsibility for peace and security. An international court, a secretariat, and economic and social bodies would connect law, administration, and human welfare to the larger peace project. The design was ambitious, but the hardest question remained unresolved: how much special power would the great powers keep for themselves? That question led to the veto. At Yalta in February 1945, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin agreed that the permanent members of the Security Council would have the ability to block substantive decisions. The veto was morally uncomfortable, especially for smaller states. It meant the new organization would not treat all governments equally when the highest security questions were on the table. But for the architects, it was the price of keeping the strongest states inside the system. The United Nations without the Soviet Union, the United States, Britain, China, or France might repeat the League's weakness. A United Nations with a veto would be compromised from birth, but alive. When the San Francisco Conference opened in April 1945, Roosevelt had just died. Harry Truman inherited both the war and the institution Roosevelt had pushed toward creation. Delegates from 50 countries gathered on the American West Coast. They arrived from states with very different sizes, governments, interests, and wartime experiences. Some represented powers that had carried enormous military burdens. Others represented countries invaded, occupied, bombed, colonized, or threatened. They were not simply applauding a finished plan. They argued over trusteeship, regional arrangements, human rights language, the powers of the General Assembly, and how much room smaller states would have inside an organization designed around great power enforcement. The resulting charter tried to hold several ideas together. Its preamble spoke in the name of peoples, not only governments. It promised faith in fundamental human rights, the dignity and worth of the human person, equal rights of men and women, and the equal rights of nations large and small. It also affirmed sovereign equality and prohibited the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, except within the Charter's own security framework. Those principles did not erase empire, racism, or power politics in 1945, but they gave future movements, lawyers, diplomats, and newly independent states words they could use against the world that produced them. The Charter's machinery reflected the same tension. The General Assembly could debate, recommend, and give voice to a widening membership. The Security Council could authorize action, but only if the permanent members did not block it. The Economic and Social Council connected peace to labor, health, education, development, and living standards. The International Court of Justice gave the system a legal arm. The Secretariat gave it continuity through an international civil service. This was not world government. It was a structured arena where sovereignty, law, bargaining, and enforcement met under rules that everyone knew were imperfect. On June 26, the signing ceremony turned months of negotiation into a physical record. Delegates placed names on the charter in the San Francisco War Memorial and Veterans Building. The photographs show formal suits, flags, desks, microphones, pens, and careful expressions. But the real drama was not the furniture. It was the burden behind the signatures. The Holocaust had exposed the abyss of state violence. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were still weeks away, but total war had already shown what industrial power could do to civilians. The charter was signed by people who knew peace could not depend on memory alone. The United Nations formally came into existence on October 24, 1945, after the charter was ratified by the required states, including the major powers. That date became United Nations Day, but the institution's authority was never automatic. It had to be tested in crises. It had to work through governments that often distrusted one another. It had to speak about human rights while many members still ruled colonies or denied rights at home. It had to confront war while the Security Council could be paralyzed by the very veto meant to keep powerful states inside. Early history showed both promise and limitation. The UN created agencies and forums that dealt with refugees, health, children, food, education, and development. It helped turn human rights language into conventions, monitoring bodies, and diplomatic pressure. It also became a stage where decolonizing states challenged older empires and where small states could force issues into public view. Yet on the central question of war and peace, the organization depended on political alignment among the powerful. When that alignment existed, the UN could act. When it did not, the charter often became an argument rather than an instrument. The Korean War made that reality visible only 5 years after San Francisco. With the Soviet delegate absent from the Security Council, the UN authorized assistance to South Korea after North Korea's invasion. That case became a rare example of collective security through the Council during the Cold War. But the same conflict also showed the limits of the system. Great power rivalry, Chinese intervention, and nuclear-era caution shaped what was possible. The charter did not abolish war. It changed the language, procedures, and legitimacy through which states argued about war. Over time, the United Nations became larger than its founders imagined. As empires collapsed, new states entered the General Assembly and used the institution to press for sovereignty, development, sanctions against apartheid, and recognition of rights. Peacekeeping, not clearly spelled out in the charter, emerged as a practical invention. Soldiers under international authority placed between former enemies, monitoring ceasefires, and sometimes protecting civilians. These missions could save lives, but they could also fail catastrophically when mandates, resources, and political will did not match the danger. That is why the UN's history often feels contradictory. It can look powerless when bombs fall and vetoes block action. It can look indispensable when aid agencies feed children, health workers coordinate vaccination, inspectors verify weapons agreements, or diplomats keep a channel open between enemies. Both views contain evidence. The institution was built neither as a world police force nor as a mere debating club. It was built as a compromise between a moral promise and a political fact. Peace after 1945 would require rules, but the strongest states would not surrender ultimate control over their own security decisions. The Charter's deepest legacy may be that it made certain claims harder to erase. Aggression had to be justified or denied, not simply celebrated as conquest. Human rights had to be answered, even by states that violated them. Small states gained a forum where their words entered the record. Colonized peoples could point to self-determination and equal rights. International law did not become all-powerful, but it became a language of pressure, shame, legitimacy, and sometimes action. The record matters because power prefers silence when evidence is inconvenient. June 26, 1945, therefore marks more than the birth of an organization. It marks a settlement with all the contradictions of the world that made it. The victorious powers wanted peace but also influence. Smaller countries wanted voice but had to accept a council where some members were more equal than others. The Charter spoke of peoples and rights while much of humanity still lived under colonial rule. It outlawed aggression while depending on states capable of aggression to enforce the rule. Those contradictions did not make the Charter meaningless. They made it a living contest. Today, when the United Nations is criticized for doing too little, the criticism often returns to the bargains made in 1945. Why should 5 permanent members hold veto power? Why can humanitarian outrage fail to become collective action? Why does international law sometimes seem strong against the weak and weak against the strong? The honest answer begins in San Francisco. The founders built an institution that could survive the presence of great powers, not one that could magically rise above them. But survival matters. The League of Nations failed partly because the world's strongest states would not bind themselves to it in a durable way. The United Nations survived because it gave those states privileges while giving the wider world procedures, language, agencies, and a public record. It is easy to mock that compromise until the alternative is visible. No forum, no common text, no legal vocabulary, no peacekeepers, no humanitarian coordination, no place where even hypocrisy must speak in the grammar of principle. The delegates who signed on June 26 did not end war. They did not solve empire, rivalry, hunger, nationalism, or fear. What they did was create a framework in which the next argument about war would have to pass through words like charter, sovereignty, human rights, Security Council, self-defense, and peace. That framework has failed many people many times. It has also saved lives, preserved records, and given weaker voices a place to accuse stronger ones. The United Nations Charter was the world's attempt to build rules out of ruins. Its history is the history of that attempt, flawed, compromised, necessary, and unfinished.